You've been told sea level rise is a slow, uniform process, water creeping evenly up every coastline on Earth. The data says something more specific and considerably stranger. The same meter of ice sheet melt can raise the sea by more in one country and barely at all in another, sometimes even lowering it near the source of the melting. The countries actually facing disappearance are Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Maldives and Nauru, atoll nations sitting a few meters above the waterline, with no higher ground to retreat to. But the real axis of this story isn't the water. It's what 5 governments have been doing about it since roughly 2009, and beneath the headlines about rising tides, a different logic is operating. One involving constitutional law, deposited coordinates at the United Nations, land purchases on foreign soil, and a quiet contest between Canberra, Washington, and Beijing for influence over the very nations that might cease to have territory at all. You picture melting ice adding water to a bathtub, rising the same amount everywhere. That model is wrong, and it has been known to be wrong since research published by geophysicist Jerry Mitrovica and colleagues in Nature in 2001, which modeled what the discipline calls sea level fingerprints. Ice sheets are massive enough to exert their own gravitational pull on the ocean around them. When the Greenland ice sheet melts, its gravitational attraction on nearby water weakens, and sea levels near Greenland can actually fall, while the redistributed water piles up disproportionately near the equator, in places like the Pacific and Indian Ocean atoll nations that contributed almost nothing to the emissions causing the melt. Here is what that mechanism actually produces. Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and the Maldives sit near the equator, far from the polar ice sheets whose melting threatens them most. The nations losing the least ice are, by the physics of gravitational redistribution, absorbing some of the worst relative sea level rise on the planet. This isn't a metaphor about global inequality. It's Newtonian gravity, quantified. You watch the tide gauge data. In Tuvalu's capital atoll, Fongafale, high tide flooding that occurred fewer than 5 days a year in recent decades is projected, according to NASA Sea Level Change Science Team, to occur roughly 25 days a year by the 2050s, and that trajectory holds regardless of any emissions path chosen between now and then, because the ocean absorbs heat and ice melt momentum on a delay measured in decades. You've been told a country disappearing beneath the ocean is unprecedented. History has a closer precedent than the headlines suggest, and it isn't hypothetical. It already happened to a Pacific nation for a different reason. In the 1960s, the tiny phosphate mining island of Nauru faced a different but structurally similar threat. Decades of open-pit mining had stripped roughly 80% of its interior down to jagged coral pinnacles, rendering the land increasingly unfit to support its population. Nauru's government, anticipating a future in which the island itself could no longer sustain its people, negotiated with Australia to purchase Curtis Island off the Queensland coast as a resettlement site, with plans that included retaining Nauruan self-government on Australian soil. The deal collapsed in 1968 over sovereignty terms Canberra wouldn't grant, and Nauruans stayed. But the negotiation itself established a template, a Pacific nation treating relocation not as a humanitarian evacuation, but as a sovereignty-preserving real estate transaction decades before climate migration existed as a policy term. The deeper question is not whether nations have faced existential displacement before. It's why the current wave of atoll nations studied that history and built their responses directly on top of it. After the physical threat comes the legal one, and this is where the analysis sharpens. Under the 1933 Montevideo Convention, statehood traditionally requires 4 elements: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter relations with other states. If an atoll nation's territory goes fully underwater, does it cease, under international law, to be a state at all? Legal scholar Maxine Burkitt, in a 2011 paper published in the journal Climate Law titled The Nation Ex Situ, argued that existing statehood doctrine was never built to handle a nation losing its entire land base to a cause it didn't create, and proposed a framework for what she called deterritorialized statehood. Sovereignty maintained through population and government continuity even after territory is gone. Jane McAdam, a specialist in international refugee and climate displacement law at the University of New South Wales, has separately documented that no existing international convention, not the 1951 Refugee Convention, not the 1954 Convention on Statelessness, was drafted with slow onset, whole territory climate loss in mind, leaving a genuine legal vacuum rather than a settled protection regime. This is where the historical record becomes useful, because Pacific nations didn't wait for the vacuum to be filled by others. In August 2021, the Pacific Islands Forum's 18 member states issued a joint declaration stating that once a nation's maritime boundaries are formally deposited with the United Nations Secretary-General under the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, those boundaries and the exclusive economic zones attached to them would remain permanent, regardless of subsequent physical changes to the coastline from sea level rise. In 2023, the Forum extended the principle further, declaring the continuity of statehood itself, asserting that a nation's legal existence does not lapse simply because its physical territory does. You watch a government photograph its coastline and file the coordinates before the ocean can argue otherwise. That is not a symbolic gesture. It's a jurisdictional claim, filed preemptively, against a fact that hasn't finished happening yet. In 2023, Tuvalu amended its constitution to explicitly declare that the state of Tuvalu will continue to exist in perpetuity, with its maritime zones and sovereignty intact, regardless of the loss of physical territory to sea level rise. No court forced this. No treaty required it. Tuvalu's government wrote the contingency into its own founding law, years ahead of the crisis it anticipates, converting a future emergency into a present legal fact. The same year, Tuvalu's then Foreign Minister, Simon Cove, delivered a speech to the COP26 climate conference while standing knee-deep in seawater at a podium placed on what used to be dry land in Funafuti. Footage the government paired with an announcement that Tuvalu intended to become the world's first digitally replicated nation, preserving its government functions, cultural records, and territorial claims inside a virtual environment. If the critics called it theater, it functioned, more precisely, as a form of evidentiary diplomacy, a government building a documented record, in real time, of a claim it expects to need in international forums for decades. Kiribati took a more direct approach. In 2014, its government purchased roughly 20 square kilometers of freehold land on Fiji's Vanuatu Island for approximately $8.77 million, initially framed publicly as an agricultural investment, but explicitly acknowledged by then-President Anote Tong as a hedge against the possibility that Kiribati's own atolls become uninhabitable. What Tong called at the time a strategy of migration with dignity, a phrase that Pacific. But the more consequential piece of Kiribati's story sits elsewhere, in a diplomatic reversal that had nothing directly to do with sea level. In 2019, Kiribati switched its diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to Beijing, one of several Pacific nations to do so in recent years, joining a wider regional pattern that includes the Solomon Islands signing a security pact with China in 2022. Washington and Canberra read these shifts as evidence that climate-vulnerable Pacific states, facing existential risk with limited leverage, will increasingly trade diplomatic alignment for infrastructure investment and security guarantees from whichever power offers the most concrete commitment. A dynamic geopolitical strategist studying great power competition would recognize as classic small state hedging, choosing patrons based on who delivers, not who shares. Here is what that competitive pressure actually produced. In November 2023, Australia signed the Falepili Union Treaty with Tuvalu, the first binding bilateral agreement in the world to explicitly link climate change, migration, and mutual security in a single instrument. Australia formally recognized Tuvalu's continuing statehood and sovereignty, regardless of future sea-level-driven territorial loss, committed to assist Tuvalu against natural disasters, pandemics, or military aggression, and created a permanent residency visa pathway, initially capped at 280 Tuvaluans per year, that does not require an employment offer, a structure unusual enough in Australian immigration law that officials called it mobility with. The treaty also requires Tuvalu to consult Australia before entering any security, defence, or infrastructure arrangement with a third country. A clause several Tuvaluan parliamentarians, including former Prime Minister Enel Sopoga, publicly criticised as trading sovereignty for protection. You notice the trade immediately. Canberra offers permanent legal refuge and disaster assistance. Tuvalu offers a de facto veto over its own foreign policy. Barry Busan's foundational work on security studies, People, States and Fear 1983, described precisely this kind of asymmetric bargain as characteristic of small states inside a great power's security perimeter. Protection is never free, and the price is usually paid in autonomy, not currency. When the visa ballot opened in June 2025, more than 3,000 of Tuvalu's roughly 11,000 citizens registered within 4 days. Within a month, the total approached half the country's population. A nation of 11,000 people had, within weeks, generated migration demand that outstripped the entire annual visa cap by more than tenfold. Not every threatened nation is planning to leave. The Maldives, an archipelago of low-lying atolls in the Indian Ocean with a maximum elevation of roughly 2.3 meters, chose a different structural response starting in the 1990s, building upward and outward rather than negotiating exit. Hulhu Malay, an artificial island constructed from dredged sand near the capital Malé, now houses tens of thousands of residents on land, engineered roughly 2 meters higher than the natural islands it was built to relieve. The government has continued pursuing floating city concepts, designed to rise with the water rather than be overtaken by it. The refrain here is not optimism. It's a different calculation of what a state actually needs to survive. The Maldives concluded that engineering its own territory upward was more defensible, legally and politically, than negotiating a future population transfer, because it keeps every element of Montevideo's statehood, population, territory, government, intact and located in the same place, rather than testing an unresolved legal theory about sovereignty without land. The Marshall Islands offers the clearest existing answer to the question every other nation in this story is still negotiating, and the answer predates climate change entirely. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests across the Marshall Islands, including the 1954 Castle Bravo detonation at Bikini Atoll, a device roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which contaminated a wider area than planners anticipated and exposed nearby populations to fallout. Residents of Bikini and Enwetak atolls were relocated, told the move was temporary. Radiation contamination made both atolls unsafe for permanent return for decades, and Bikini remains largely uninhabited today, its former residents and their descendants still legally classified as displaced, still negotiating compensation through a tribunal established for that purpose. Here is what that history actually produced. In 1986, the United States and the Marshall Islands signed the Compact of Free Association, a treaty granting the U.S. military exclusive access to the Kwajalein Atoll missile testing range in exchange for defense guarantees, financial assistance, and, critically, a provision allowing Marshallese citizens to live, work, and study in the United States indefinitely, without a visa, without a lottery, without an annual cap. The compact was renewed in 2023 with an additional $700 million in funding commitments. You'd expect this migration channel, once it existed, to sit unused. It hasn't. An estimated tens of thousands of Marshallese now live in the United States, with the largest concentrated community not in Honolulu or Los Angeles, but in Springdale, Arkansas, drawn there since the 1980s by jobs in the region's poultry processing industry. A migration pattern almost entirely invisible in mainstream coverage of Pacific climate displacement, because it began as compensation for nuclear contamination, not sea level rise. The deeper question the Marshall Islands case answers is not whether a displaced Pacific population can be absorbed into a foreign labor market. It already has been, for nearly 40 years, under a legal framework built for an entirely different emergency. Nauru's history carries a second lesson beyond the failed Curtis Island negotiation. What happens to a population when relocation plans collapse and the underlying environmental damage remains? Decades of phosphate extraction left much of Nauru's interior a moonscape of jagged limestone pinnacles, unfit for agriculture or habitation, forcing almost the entire population onto a narrow coastal ring. The same coastal ring now most exposed to storm surge and sea level rise. Nauru's per capita GDP collapsed after the phosphate reserves were exhausted in the 1990s, and the country's most reliable recent revenue sources have included hosting an Australian-run offshore immigration detention centre, a role that draws its own separate scrutiny, but underscores a structural point. A nation that loses its land-based economic base becomes dependent on arrangements with larger powers, almost by default, whether that dependency is negotiable. You watch a pattern repeat across three nations facing the same underlying vulnerability, arriving at three different strategic answers. The Marshall Islands secured an open migration channel decades in advance as compensation for a different disaster. The Maldives chose to engineer new land rather than negotiate an exit. Nauru's early attempt at a negotiated resettlement collapsed, and the country absorbed both the environmental damage and the resulting economic dependency. None of these outcomes was inevitable. Each reflects a specific set of choices made by specific governments, years before the current wave of climate diplomacy existed to describe them. Myth: these nations will vanish underwater all at once, in a single dramatic submersion. Reality: uninhabitability arrives years before full submersion, through saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers, failed crops, and king tide flooding that makes daily life untenable long before the last dry ground disappears. Why it's false? It treats a decades-long degradation process as a single future event, when the relevant policy window is now, not some fixed date in 2100. Myth: sea level rise affects every coastline equally. Reality: Mitrovica's gravitational fingerprinting shows the nations closest to melting ice sheets can see smaller local rises, while equatorial atoll nations, the ones with the least capacity to adapt, absorb a disproportionate share of the redistributed water. Why it's false? It obscures the specific injustice of the mechanism, where the physics itself concentrates risk on nations that produced almost none of the emissions driving it. Myth: a submerged nation simply ceases to exist under international law. Reality: no binding global consensus exists on this question, and Pacific nations are actively writing the law themselves, through the Forum's 2021 and 2023 declarations, and through domestic constitutional amendments like Tuvalu's, faster than international bodies are resolving it. Why it's false? It assumes a settled legal void where an active first-mover legal strategy is already underway. Myth: climate migration agreements are purely humanitarian gestures. Reality: The Falepili Union's consultation clause on third country security arrangements shows migration pathways are being built inside broader strategic competition over Pacific alignment. Why it's false. Treating the treaty as charity alone misses the leverage both governments are exercising over each other. You will not get a single date when these nations disappear. The Maldives may still exist, physically in 2100, propped on engineered land. Tuvalu may exist as a legally continuous state with almost no habitable soil left, its population and government relocated, but its sovereignty, on paper, unbroken. Nauru's own history shows a resettlement plan can fail entirely, and the population can simply endure a degraded homeland instead. What the record does show clearly is this. Every nation examined here started acting on this threat as a legal and diplomatic problem years before it became an unavoidable physical one, depositing coordinates, amending constitutions, purchasing land abroad, signing security-linked treaties. The nations most exposed to disappearing were not the passive subjects of this story. They were its most active authors. Robert D. Kaplan's The Revenge of Geography, 2012, argued that physical geography still constrains national strategy even in an era of digital connectivity and global institutions, that where a state sits on the map shapes what options remain available to it, no matter how much technology or diplomacy tries to compensate. The 5 nations in this story are a live test of that argument's outer limit. What happens when the geography itself is the thing being subtracted, not just the constraint imposed by it? Tuvalu's constitutional amendment and digital nation project are, in effect, an attempt to keep a state's strategic identity intact after Kaplan's variable, the physical land, has been removed from the equation entirely, testing whether statehood can survive without the one element geography-based theories of power always assumed would remain. You will watch this story unfold in fragments over the coming decades. A visa ballot here, a UN filing there, a security clause quietly added to a bilateral treaty. None of these fragments will arrive, labeled as the main event. Each one is the main event, arriving early, exactly the way the nations most exposed to this threat have been treating it for over a decade. The next time you read a headline about a country at risk of vanishing, you won't just be picturing a coastline underwater. You'll be looking for the treaty, the deposited coordinates, and the great power quietly offering a visa in exchange for a say in that nation's foreign policy. If this reframed how you're reading climate coverage, the next video goes into a resource access dynamic in the Arctic that almost no mainstream coverage has mapped correctly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.